Well, welcome everyone to another Sci-Tech Asia webinar. Um, Today it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker today, Aalok Khandekar. He is an assistant professor of anthropology, sociology at the Departments of Liberal Arts and Climate Change, Indian Institute of Technology in Hyderabad. Aalok's recent research has focused on environmental health governance infrastructures in the urban global south. And he has also been actively involved in supporting the development of scholarly research infrastructures, both digital and social. As an example, he is part of the design group of the Platform for Experimental Collaborative Ethnography, an open source platform to support collaborative data sharing and analysis in the empirical humanities. He is also a founding member of the transnational STS and Trans-Asia STS networks, and is currently serving as editor-in-chief of Engaging Science, Technology and Society, the open access journal for the Society for Social Studies of Science, also known as 4S. Today's talk, entitled Accounting for the Local in Heat Action Planning, is actually a talk that comes out of an ongoing research project. Aalok is going to be talking on behalf of a collective that is doing an ESRC-GCRF funded project entitled Cool Infrastructures, Life with Heat in the Off-Grid City, which seeks to understand how marginalized groups in the urban global south are adapting to rising temperatures in their cities. So without further ado, Aalok, I shall hand over the floor to you, please. I would like to ask everyone to switch off your cameras and microphones so that we can guarantee a smooth broadcasting experience. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction, Gonzalo, and thank you to the organizers of Sci-Tech Asia Network for this invitation. It's already been rescheduled twice, so I really appreciate your patience as well. So let me start by sharing my screen. And can someone please confirm that you can see the presentation?
Yes, it's great. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So as Gonzalo said, my talk today is entitled Accounting for the Local in Heat Action Planning. And this is a paper that I'm collaboratively developing with, along with Jamie Cross, who is at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Edinburgh, and Anand Maranganti, who is the director of the Hyderabad Urban Lab here in the city, who's a collaborator on the project as well. The larger project, as Gonzalo said, is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council of the UK as part of the Grand Challenges Research Fund. And it's looking specifically at access to heat and thermal practices in what we are calling the off-grid city, of how marginalized populations in cities across Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, how are they adapting to rising temperatures in their cities, right? And so there's three specific research themes that different people in different cities are pursuing further. One of them is looking at heat in relation to inequality, and specifically heat as a gendered phenomenon, and to think about how a focus on heat allows us to understand the city itself differently, better than we have so far. Another focus of the city, another focus of the project is on what we're calling cool infrastructures, and it is looking at the configuration of systems, materials, technologies, relationship with knowledge, for which marginalized urban residents are currently meeting their needs for cooling in the off-grid city. and lastly, to look at social practices themselves and to look at unsettling some of the assumptions that characterize the literature around thermal tolerance, for example, around universalizing assumptions about people's capacity to tolerate and people's capacity to adapt to rising temperatures. And so some of our collaborators are especially building on social practice theory, looking at thermal practices, needs, and capacities of these marginal constructs. I'm happy to say more about the project eventually if there are other questions. For now, I'm going to focus specifically on some of the work we have been doing over the past year. Let me preface my comments by saying that this is still a very preliminary output from the project. We started in the middle of a pandemic, and it's meant that we are only now tentatively beginning to imagine what field-based research for the project looks like. Okay? And so much of what I'm going to be presenting is based on things that we have been doing remotely over the past year as by way of preparatory work for what is about to come in the next 2 years. And what I'm going to focus specifically on today is the idea of governance, the idea of thermal governance, and to think about what are, like, in the face of many predictions, which especially locate South Asia as being particularly vulnerable to the effects of extreme heat. What are some of the responses that you're beginning to see? How is the state at different levels? Like, how is it planning for planning for managing the risks and the threats that rising temperatures pose across the South Asian region. And this, like, you see that, you see many, like, the prediction, the map you're seeing in front of you right now comes from a report called Sustainable Energy for All, which was commissioned by, it's called Chilling Prospects, which is commissioned by this coalition called Sustainable Energy for All. And this is particular, like, this becomes both an entry point, as a particularly interesting entry point for us, because like, one of the measures that this document champions is the Ahmedabad heat action plan, which I'll be talking about at length in this particular presentation. Right? So what you are beginning to see in many of this emerging work is both an attention to the developing world, attention to the global south, and specifically looking at the impacts of climate change in the form of extreme heat events, but also specific attention to those who are the most vulnerable, those who are most at risk in these situations. And in this, India is, like I said, South Asia is consistently predicted to be among the most affected, most at risk from the effects of extreme temperatures. And what I'm going to follow through in some detail today is then one of the first heat action plans that was developed in India, which was for the western city of Ahindabad. So you see that on your map towards the center west part of India, Ahmedabad, which is in red at 46 degrees centigrade. And so this city, after having experiencing a deadly heat wave in the year 2010, was in some ways very quick to action in terms of developing a heat action plan. And we're going to talk about that at some length today. This was published in the year 2013. But what I'm also interested in then talking about is how this plan becomes a template for the development of heat action plans across the peninsula. Right? And so you see that since the publication of the Ahmedabad plan in the year 2013, we now have about 30 different heat action plans active in India at the level of individual cities or sometimes at the level of entire states. And so it's as much like the plan itself is interesting, but what's also interesting for us is this particular scaling up of the Ahmedabad heat action plan, how it becomes a plan regionally, but also nationally, but also regionally. So you see Karachi's heat action plan, for example, is developed by some of the same actors that are involved in the development of the Ahmedabad heat action plan. The Cooling for All document that I cited earlier in the previous slide, that also champions the Ahmedabad heat action plan as an example of here is how southern cities can proactively be planning for their for these extreme heat scenarios, right? And so the Ahmedabad heat action plan quickly becomes this kind of model for how as championed as this model for how southern cities can plan for heat emergencies, and it's like that movement and like what happens in that particular movement, what is enabled, but also potentially what gets limited, is what I want to trace in this paper, right? It's not so much that part of what happens in scaling up isn't so much that the attention to the local is entirely lost. So it's not, but what does happen is the local manifests in very particular ways, right? And how you account for the local, what counts as the local, is a very, very limited, is a very particular vision of how you make these templates work in specific situations. And that's the kind of argument that I want to trace in this analysis. What I draw centrally on two literatures in this particular instance. One of them builds on broadly on disaster, on the literature on disaster and STS, which disaster STS. And also drawing a little bit on literature on policy transfer, how like policies how policies travel from one context to another. Right? Specifically on the on disaster STS, the insights I'm particularly interested here and going on is to pay attention to the temporalities of disaster itself. Where often like, so in these documents, for example, in heat action planning documents, the point of attention is the heat wave, an extreme heat event that is delimited in time and space. It affects, it can be very precisely pinpointed to when it begins to when it ends. And all governmental interventions in some ways, by and large, focus on mitigating loss of life and loss of property in that particular in that particular period of time, right? And yet, and so what in the disaster literature often gets called as a fast disaster or as an acute disaster, right? And contemporary disaster STS literature is pushing back against those framings of the disaster, and instead trying to both trying to understand the structural kind of conditions that that configure disaster in specific ways. That means that the distribution of risks and rewards is very uneven. Right? So I mean, both disaster is having the conditions for, in this case, heat to become disastrous, right? As being in existence for a much longer time. And then they also, the implications for them also lasting for much longer than is potentially captured in the time window that might be characterized as the heat wave. Right? So it's both in terms of its temporality as well as its spatiality. Disaster STS literature is really expanding and really the horizons of what constitutes the disaster. Right? You also see Rob Nixon's work here is especially, and the idea of slow violence here is particularly interesting for us as well, to think about what it might mean to think about heat waves differently. And if heat action plans don't focus just on the heat wave, And if it doesn't quite institute, like what they are doing is institutionalizing a disaster imaginary, which is important in terms of having governmental effects, but it also means that it is limiting attention in specific ways as well. The second strand of a sub-theme in the disaster STS literature, which we are beginning to pick up on, is around the nature of knowledge and nature of expertise in the context of disaster. And this is where we talk about the people who were the institutions and the individuals behind the formulation of the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan, right? But also how they mobilize then and how they provide momentum for the plan to accelerate and to be scaled up in the way it has been in a very short period of time. There's a smaller literature here on heat waves themselves. The most famous one is Klinenberg's book on social autopsy in the context of the Chicago heat wave. There's also Keller's work on Paris, on the Paris heat wave in 2003, which borrows significantly from Klinenberg's work as well. And the older historical accounting of the heat wave in New York City in 1896, Hot Time in the Old Town by Edward Cohn. And it continues many of the themes, of the themes that the disaster STS literature already works with in other contexts as well, namely to think about heat waves themselves as slow disasters, as providing windows into larger patterns of social breakdown. So social isolation becomes a particularly important insight and analytic both for Klinenberg as well as Keller, for example. Those elderly or homeless populations end up being particularly at risk and both invisible and particularly at risk in such situations. So talking about differential vulnerabilities, but also to think about new forms of urban inequality and what Keller's a memorable phrase here, the microgeographies of vulnerability, and which in the context of Paris, he is talking about how within the microecology of an apartment building, people on the very top floor, often living in these very not well ventilated spaces, right? End up part of who was susceptible to thermal stress in the context of Paris, were these people inhabiting these top floors of these poorly ventilated apartment buildings. So thinking about these potentially newer kinds of microgeographies of vulnerability as well. And what Klinenberg especially is drawing our attention to is also heat waves, not just disasters more generally, not just they also become symbolic and culturally salient events, right? They become, and so the way the disaster gets talked about in the media, for instance, also helps us further think about what disasters reveal about contemporary urban configurations. With that, let me get into some of the empirical material that I'm working with. And as I said, the central kind of document that we are working with is the Ahindabad Heat Action Plan. Ahindabad itself experiences a deadly heat wave with about 1,300 or so excess deaths attributed specifically to the heat wave in this year 2010. And this is after already experiencing a very deadly earthquake in the early 2000s. And so in many ways, one of the reasons why Ahmedabad becomes a city in which the heat action plan can develop or could develop was also that it has this previous disaster of history, which means that there is different governmental and civil society organizations which are quite interested in thinking about disaster management and disaster governance. Uh, so in the aftermath of this disaster, in the aftermath of the heat wave, a few different organizations, including the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Public Health Foundation of India, which is an Indian public-private partnership, which was established in 2006, specifically to advance public health education, training, and research. The municipal corporation itself, right? And eventually joined by a few more organizations as well. Like all of them get funding for first £200,000 and later on again for another £300,000 by the Climate Knowledge Development Network, itself funded by the governments of Netherlands, Canada, as well as the International Development Research Agency. Right. Spent quite a lot of time doing preparatory work, doing surveys, conducting studies in order to understand what are the specific sources of vulnerability for different kinds of population groups. So, and there's a finer understanding of, there's an understanding that there's different populations who are differently susceptible. So those who are working outdoors, for example, or those who might be living in urban slums. And so how do we think about and account for the kinds of risk and the kinds of interventions, consequently, that we might have to design in order to minimize heat stress and mortality associated with heat. So what eventually became the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan was the product of significant preparatory work, including multiple studies aimed at identifying vulnerable communities, estimating deaths from extreme heat, etc. With their first 2 years of funding, the team produced the first detailed data set on the effects of extreme heat in what the team described a developing country setting. This study set out to detail the effects of the 2010 heat wave on mortality, and it developed a methodology that put heat wave related deaths in the city at about 1,344 people. The study and the data had its own limitations. It was unable, for example, to stratify the deaths by socioeconomic status, with the implication that, as the authors acknowledge, the findings provide little specific insight into factors that may affect risk. It used ambient temperature data as a proxy for indoor temperature. Neither was it able to analyze the impact of confounding variables from air pollution to infectious disease outbreaks on the effects of the 2010 heat wave. Right. Really, and what I want to emphasize in talking about the Ahmedabad heat wave, Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan, is that the group was both mindful of the limitations of the study, limitations of their own findings and own planning, but was fairly careful in terms of attending to the local specificities, the local political economies, the social relationships through which people manage and manage rising temperature. Right? And they include then in the heat action plan itself prescribes a range of interventions, starting from like how do we develop early warning systems that make sense in the local context, to how do we build preparedness and response capacity among the medical professionals and public health professionals. What kind of public awareness campaigns do you need to design in order to minimize harmful impact of exposure to heat on human health, and so on. Right? They also proposed and piloted a number of heat health interventions. These included the formation of specialist working groups to catalyze development cooperation between local government agencies, the public health bodies, and meteorological agencies, specialist training for medical officers, an extreme heat early warning system based on probabilistic weather forecasting, and a heat action plan. Right? So the group itself was fairly prolific, made a lot of effort to both not just conduct these studies and produce local understandings of what, like, how do we understand vulnerability in the context of rising temperatures. But then they also were quite prolific in terms of publishing their findings. Right, a range of scientific publications come out of this particular group. There's also a number of just public awareness kind of events. There's a lot of published information from presentations made by this group to very self-consciously scale up the Ahmedabad experience of heat action, of how do you develop a heat action plan for your city, what kinds of things do you take into consideration, and so on and so forth. And just getting a lot of, like, within the particular agencies, including the Natural Resource Defense Council, getting a lot of exposure and a lot of publicizing not just the heat action plan itself, but also just know-how and about how do you go about planning for heat waves and developing your own heat action plans. Right? This slide like re-emphasizes some of the same things that I was talking about in the previous slide, which is the attention to local specificity in order to develop a heat action plan, which is time and again foregrounded by this particular group of people. And then the other point, which is around it being prolific in terms of publicizing its results, both in terms of scientific outputs, but also in terms of public presentations, and thinking about, like, who the different stakeholders are, how do you engage them, and so on and so forth. Just a minute. One of the other outputs, which ends up being quite influential here also, is what they call a city resilience toolkit. Right, and this is the document that becomes that provides something of a 7-step guide for other cities to develop their own heat action plans, right? Which is launched at the COP21 meetings in Paris, and then as I showed in my as I mentioned in my earlier slide, it's something that gets further picked up and championed by global coalitions such as the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. I should also say at this point that the Ahindabad Heat Action Plan itself is drawing on itself is building on the experience of especially the state of New South Wales in Australia. So Melbourne's Heat Action Plan becomes a source of inspiration for the Ahmedabad plan, as well as a number of European initiatives that get formulated in the aftermath of the 2003, I believe, heat wave. Yeah, 2003 heat wave in Europe as well. Right? And so even while it is like the Ahmedabad plan is trying to take into account local specificities, and it's is quite conscious of its being located in a what they call a developing country setting. It does have its sources of inspiration nonetheless are also fairly global at that point, like deriving specifically from Australian and European Australian and European governance interventions as well. And, what the City Resilience Toolkit ends up doing is giving you a 7-step kind of process in terms of what all you need to do. Here's if you are the city administration thinking about developing a heat action plan for yourself, you need to think about city engagement, about vulnerability assessment and establishing heat health threshold temperatures, and so on. In a very formulaic kind of fashion, right? So what you get are things like checklists and so these specific techniques that facilitate the easy kind of scaling up for different kinds of actors in terms of developing heat action plans. Right? And while as such, it does enable the plan to travel, what it does is also to a certain extent, make invisible the kind of careful work that went into the formulation of the Ahmedabad plan itself. It also, to some extent, obfuscates the structural conditions and the social inequalities that produce thermal experiences. One of the other things that this kind of scaling up also does is to really delimit individual agency, or like even individual or community resilience or agency in the context of extreme heat specifically. And so, for example, you talk many of these documents and subsequently talk about individual adaptability or social adaptability only as a negative kind of attribute. Right? And so any reference to social connection, for example, describes its negation. One high-profile summary of the work in Ahmedabad produced by the funding agency lists the factors that increase vulnerability to heat waves or heat risk. These include social isolation and cultural norms. There's no mention of the factors, however, factors, strategies, or cultural practices that might actually reduce vulnerability. Right? And so the idea that people depend on kin networks, for example, or their own extended social networks, and as a strategy for mitigating some of the excessive, some of the impacts of excessive heat, is nowhere then visible in this document. Right? I mean, so adaptability and adaptation is something that governments do in that sense. When you read it from the perspective of these documents, there is a illusion of individual or community agency and resilience in this context. And so much so, right? I mean, so in the next scale, this is now coming closer, in the next slide, this is coming closer to our own field sites. So this is the state of Telangana, of which Hyderabad is the capital city, which is one of our field sites. And what happens is, by the time the heat action plan, like all of which reference the Ahmedabad plan, by the time these come to the city of Hyderabad or the state of Telangana, the local essentially becomes, or the only way the local gets represented is by an overlaying of temperature data along with mortality and morbidity data. Much of the work that went into the formulation of the Ahmedabad plan, like, I mean, mapping of green spaces, for example, recognizing that certain parts of the city have far greater green space than other parts of the city, or an attention to what places were connected on the transit routes, so the BRTS, the bus rapid transit system in Ahmedabad, for example, servicing the western part of the city far better than it served the eastern part of the city, and how all of these together contribute to making individuals and populations vulnerable. All of this kind of specificity then gets lost in the subsequent kinds of maps, right? So much so that in some of the other heat action plans that are in place for other parts of the country, literally the name of the city or the places is in the title of the document, and then found nowhere else in the document at all. So there is in some extent, in some instances, there is a complete erasure of the local. In other instances, there's a very limited way in which the local is and can be represented within these specific within these kind of governance documents. Right? So it ends up making heat governance somewhat quite programmatic, right? As it gets as it travels across the country, and so while beginning to just anticipate some of things I have to say in conclusion, while it ends up being an important milestone in terms of drawing attention to any kind of heat, drawing attention to heat as something that needs to be on the government's agenda at all. Its rapid transfer its rapid transfer across different contexts has also meant that that it does so in very specific ways, right? So what these heat action plans do in some ways is that they institutionalize disaster imaginary, right? Which has been further entrenched as the plan travels to other parts of the country. In contrast, the wide adaptation of these plans has taken place without attention to the sociocultural, political, economic, and geographic specificities that so concerned those involved in the development of the original Ahmedabad intervention, right? Instead, the rapid scaling of the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan, advocated by collaborating institutions and encouraged by the NDMA, which is the National Disaster Management Authority, has occurred at the expense of the kind of careful engagement with local specificities that was so crucial to its initial development. What explains this shift in accounting? The rapid replication of policy and program across multiple sites is a phenomenon that has attracted the attention of critical geographers and urbanists since the 1990s, when it appeared as an engine of neoliberalism. Right? One of the earliest studies of fast policy replications was a study of work-fairest policies that were rapidly adopted by city after city with federal backing in the US and then by governments in Western Europe. This comes from the work of Jamie Peck. Among the most intriguing features of these processes was that as governments adopted policy packages from elsewhere, their suitability and adaptability to local specificity was lost. Extending Jamie Peck's critical analysis of such fast policy transfer, we might argue that the rise of the Heat Action Plan involves a similar politics of scale and a scalar disconnect, now shaped by the contours of the climate emergency rather than the instantiation of market logics. In both cases, these fast policies naturalize the local as a politically optimal site of coping and adaptation, and identifies the local with those authorities and institutions deemed capable of orchestrating actions within the parameters of the urban. However, unlike previous projects of urban meta-governance, the Heat Action Plan does not yet directly incorporate or appropriate into the language of social policy the forms or rhetorics of street-level improvisation, material experimentation, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Instead, the realm or domain of social practice is absent entirely. So what practices, organizational forms, and social technologies are implicated in this transplanting of policy from one socio-spatial context to another? Our analysis suggests that understanding the role of a particular group of transnational actors and institutions in facilitating the travel of heat action planning might be key. In the scaling up of the Ahindabad Heat Action Plan, we see the consolidation of particular, and here we go on Peter Haas's work, of particular epistemic community that entails the coming together of a particular group of experts and institutions supported with particular kinds of funding mechanisms, producing particular kinds of documentary forms and templates for action, all within an overarching imaginary of the heat wave as a disaster. While our analysis suggests that the formation of this epistemic community has been vital for generating political attention to heat wave governance, further research is needed to understand how exactly this group came to be consolidated and what it does. Our preliminary foray in this direction suggests at least three factors at play: presence of a coordinating agency and funding effectively, setting up command centers and conveyor belts for transfer of knowledge and technology, incentivization and motivation for designating individuals in each recipient organization, and clearly articulated best practices upon which adaptation will lead to incentivization. Undertaking such research will entail methodological nimbleness. Conventional research methods, such as interviews, participant observation, focus group discussions, will only ever allow for partial understanding of the dynamics of policy transfer in the present case. Focusing on documents, as we have done in this essay, will also yield partial results. Negotiations, agreements, and accommodations that go into making action plans and the policy and enabling their travel are difficult to establish through such an analysis. For example, it is common knowledge that policy expertise is exchanged in conferences, which are exclusionary by their very nature, not least because of high participation costs. It is also known that in many cases, policy is developed in an entrepreneurial spirit by individual actors, people with the necessary competencies, knowledge, and willingness to take a risk at the same time as they are able to act as policy socializers and evangelicals. Heat action planning documents are often produced by named individuals as much as departments, people for whom their production and circulation presents a useful measure of professional action and achievement. Locating and understanding this figure of the policy entrepreneur in the case of the heat action plan may enable us to further trace a number of arrangements that are critical to these operations that result in replication of policy and program. Understanding fast policy transfer around urban heat will therefore need methodological innovation that establishes both its tacit as well as its explicit dimensions. Further research is also necessary to understand the pathways not taken. What might a different framing of heat waves that recognizes its disastrous potential, but also pays attention to overheating as a chronic phenomenon in the southern city and renders different populations differently vulnerable to heat entail? What kinds of epistemic communities might facilitate such an attention to heat? What would it take to layer slowness in the form of sustained attention and mutual learning across contexts, in addition to the fast policy processes that seem to be at play? Against the backdrop of widely shared and urgent concerns with climate change, the Urban Heat Action Plan is a seductive tool. It allows individuals and institutions to envisage a direct causal relationship between policy and human life in a moment defined by climate change. And it allows people to demonstrate action, to establish their commitment to action, to be able to claim that they are doing something or taking the prospect of future change seriously. Amongst those claiming the success of the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan as their own, we find, for example, the international consultancy firm PricewaterhouseCoopers, which co-financed the Climate Knowledge Development Network, that in turn provided by the initial grant funding that led to the development of this plan, as well as India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. The ability to strategically deploy the heat action plan to political ends reminds us that as we contend with the implications of climate change, contemporary forms of government are enmeshed in new ecologics of power, in which technologies of control and care for populations are inseparable from action on planetary risks and futures. From this starting point, the question of what the heat action plan actually does in practice is an entirely different project altogether. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Aalok. Could you please stop sharing the screen? Yes, thank you. That was very thought-provoking. I will be chairing this this session and this Q&A session, and like to ask every participant if you'd like to ask questions about the presentation. Please express your desire to do so via the chat box or simply use the hand function in Zoom. If you prefer to ask your questions in writing, please do so via the chat box, which is already open. As the chair of this session, I'm going to use the privilege of asking the first session, perhaps allowing participants to kind of gather their thoughts and think more carefully about the question that they'd like to ask. I mean, this is a very thought-provoking project, Aalok, very rich. The presentation was extremely rich. I understand that it's still at the very kind of preliminary level, and it feels that way, which is great for discussion. It seemed to me that you were focusing on the the heat action plans as some kind of globally circulating artifacts. And you were looking at the circulation at the level of policy making in the case of India. And it seemed to me that you were making kind of 2 points that, as in all kind of widely implemented programs or regulatory programs, there's some kind of scaling up process involved. And of course, there are many losses in the process of scaling up. And I think you seem to have focused on two. One is, the fact that it seems to be eliding the local level work involved in the production of these plans. And at the same time, it also obfuscates the question of inequality. I mean, the question of inequalities is a very important one, especially in the STS literature. I'm reminded of Sheila Jazanov's classic argument in The Ethics of Invention, saying that, the basic ethical issue in disaster, of course, is the issue of inequality. And I think that that your project is going to be a classic showing precisely this issue. Of course, because the research is very preliminary, you don't really have much data on it. I'd like to know a little bit more about the construction of vulnerability groups, which you talked a little bit, but you didn't have time to explain a little bit more. And I also have a methodology question. Which I think sort of concerns probably most of us working on these kinds of issues, relating to climate change, global heating, and so on and so forth, is how do we ourselves account for the local in the way we are doing research? Because you're kind of talking about the illusion of the local in the scaling up process of implementing, regulatory programs. So how do you yourself are going to, what kinds of methodologies and insights are you going to bring in to kind of account for the local? And what the local means here, is it India? Is it regions within India? I suppose we could start with these two questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Gonzalo. Let me maybe start with the methodological question first, and then I'll come to the question around vulnerability. And I don't have a perfect answer by a long shot in terms of how all we are going to go about accounting for the local. But I think, as we embark on the more serious kind of identification of field sites, for example, where is it that we are actually going to understand the effects of other kinds of vulnerabilities that climate change, and in this instance, specifically heat, is producing in and around the city. I guess the first answer to your question is the local is at the level of the urban, we are specifically focusing on the city of Hyderabad, and even that is already too big a space, right? It's a city of 9 million people, and to think about how do we actually think about the local in that context, and who is more or less vulnerable in this context is still needs a lot more situated answers. So I think from the outset, some of the things we are doing in response is involving stakeholders very early on. And we haven't quite identified our field sites yet. So even as we are building these maps of thermal maps for the cities, which are only partly about temperatures and so on. So using spatial data sets that are available, but also then generating our own data sets in addition to layer on these in terms of how do you think about population density vis-a-vis questions around heat and so on and so forth. So part of our strategy at the moment is to think about using these heat maps as a way of decision-making tools in terms of thinking through some of the questions around vulnerability, knowing, especially as STS researchers, that those maps are ever only going to tell us so much. And to begin then engaging with stakeholders early on to actually enroll stakeholders in telling us what makes sense. How do we read these maps? How do we actually think about vulnerability? Is it a spatial location? Is it a location? How do we think about this particular question? And complicated all the more at this particular moment where I think COVID is almost a defining context, which is inextricably linked up with with the project as well, even though we didn't quite start off thinking about that specific question. And so, so in figuring out that particular question methodologically is an ongoing kind of process rather than something we have an answer from the beginning. The question of vulnerability also, I think there's an assumption in many of the documents that we are looking is that we already know what vulnerability in this context looks like. And one of the most common assumptions, included in the Ahindabad document, is that people living in slums are among the most vulnerable to the effects of extreme heat. That's partly because of access or lack of access to basic infrastructure. So like one of the things we did last year, for example, was a remote survey in the context of COVID in partnership with the Red Cross International. We conducted remote surveys in all 4 countries. And one of the things that very clearly gets highlighted is like to think about like thermal governance in this context is also to think about access to infrastructure like electricity and water, and those become especially important in terms of figuring out like how people are able to access any kind of relief at all. And so people living in urban slums who are not necessarily part of the official of the formal like infrastructural grid are vulnerable to, because of those conditions. They are vulnerable also because of poor housing conditions, very badly ventilated spaces, very cramped spaces, just a large number of people living in very small spaces and so on. But nonetheless, it is still an assumption. I mean, it is not something that has necessarily been tested. It also means that we aren't, and what the pandemic especially highlights is we haven't, in the context of at least, I think climate governance more generally, but certainly in the context of thermal governance, we don't know how to deal with the question of compound disaster or compound vulnerability. So how different kind of vulnerabilities kind of intersect with each other and how they produce differential kind of effects. And so I think in that, again, like, I mean, how do we think about vulnerability in this context is not quite a given. Right? And it's not something that we, it feels like, it seems as if a lot of the policy documents seem to assume that we know in a way that I don't think is experientially quite true. And so that like beginning from like those places become like places for us to start in terms of then thinking through some of the other issues involved.
So we're starting to have a lot of questions. I think the next on the list is Emma, please. Emma.
Thanks, Aalok. Thanks, Aalok, for that really great talk. Yeah, I was going to ask, one of my questions was about COVID and whether heat action plans have, if they've done anything or they tell us anything about how well particular cities respond to COVID. I mean, you've kind of started to answer that, but maybe a little bit more on that. And just my other question was, yeah, I mean, you mentioned that Australia is also has developed heat action plans, and one of the things that's really strikes me about from living in Melbourne, where there are have been some really serious heat waves, and we expect more of them with climate change, is the kind of the sociality within heat waves. And I don't know if this is captured in a heat action plan, but things like checking on neighbours, particularly checking on elderly neighbours. And another one is people who leave children in cars on a hot day. So there's lots of people get demonized a lot for doing that because children can die. So it's certainly, it's a very serious thing, but there's also people will call the police if they see a child in a car and no parent there. So I just wondered about the kinds of socialities. I know that, you're still to do the majority of the field work, but whether that is also something that's missed in a heat action plan.
Right. Thanks, Emma. So the COVID question is interesting. In many ways, it was the starting point of where this paper began, even though COVID isn't directly reflected in this paper. It began with a post I think we did for somatosphere last year, and there's also a separate paper under consideration right now, which talks about how, in many ways, like climate governance or climate security and biosecurity interventions have very paradoxical pulse, right? And so specifically with COVID and heat governance, right? And a lot of the infrastructural solutions that are imagined for overheating are like creation of cooling centers, or the creation of like public access points for drinking water and so on and so forth. Right? But all of it is something that actually involves people coming together, right? In a way that COVID almost negates, right? And like all the solutions to COVID are actually how do you isolate and how do you keep people separate from each other. So I just wanted to mention that particular kind of um, paradox that is at play in governments here. So what we are still trying to make sense of is this kind of very rapid kind of scale up of the heat action plan itself, right? Because we are really not sure what it actually does, and we are even not sure why it actually happened as quickly as it did. And so from like having none in like 2013 to having like in like 6 or 7 years later, we have 30 of them, right? I mean, that's like a very kind of rapid kind of scale up in a way that doesn't seem to be explained by any kind of like heat waves aren't like a politically salient phenomenon, for example, like and all the environmental crises that will get the attention and media attention, like you might find air pollution like becoming a really serious problem. You like droughts and not have like either flooding or droughts, depending on when the year you're talking about. Those seem to be politically much more immediate kind of problems, and we still don't seem to have like a reasonable or like any kind of well-articulated framework in place for them. And so like why heat waves in particular like get the kind of like seem to have gotten the kind of response that they do is not entirely clear. And I'm not sure that because like I think there is more work to be done in terms of like understanding like how that unfolds and why that unfolds. I'm less sure that it actually tells us too much about COVID responses. It's also because COVID responses, like in terms of governance and the way it manifests, it happens at a different scale. It's far more centralized. It happens from the center and then like eventually devolved to the state governments, rather than heat action plans still primarily imagined as city-centric. So even when their entire states formulate, and then there is like still the assumption that it's a municipal corporation that becomes the kind of locus of action. So there's some kind of a scale, they seem, in terms of governance, they actually seem to be playing out at different scales. In terms of sociality, I think for that one, like we are going to need more field work. Like I'm curious about how the heat wave actually shows up as an event and during the field work itself. To what extent do people recognize and register it, and like even alter their daily rhythms to account for the period of living. So there's a lot of suggestion around like don't work during the hottest period of the day and so on and so forth. To what extent that happens, to what extent is it a possibility for especially those whose jobs might not be of the kind that can accommodate that kind of rate. Is still something that needs to be seen. And there is, like, if you look at the official kind of documentation out there and put out by the Disaster Management Authority and such, you will see something similar. I haven't seen anything around like specifically children, but checking on your neighbors and checking especially on elderly population, like on the elderly who might be especially vulnerable to extreme heat. That is something that is reflected in the the do's and don'ts in the context of the heat wave.
Thanks, Aalok. We have another question from Loretta. Loretta, please.
Yes. Hi, Aalok. Thank you so much for the presentation. I have like it gives me so much to think about. I will try to like summarize because I was trying to think how to ask the question. So I'll just ask a brief one. So I guess my question constitutes of two parts. Like I think in one of the slides you mentioned about the temporality of disaster, which I think is something like it's a framework that's been talking quite a bit in STS. So I think the first time I came across with it is Jerry C's paper on sandstorms in China. I don't know if you've read about it. So he talked about the temporality of disaster. I guess first of all, I would like to maybe have some clarification in case I miss anything. Are you in your work, are you also emphasizing the temporality of heat wave disaster, or are you actually challenging this framework? Because when I think about heat wave, it's something so mundane and is something quite persistent. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about how your work relates to this framework about temporality of disaster. I think maybe you're challenging it because you are talking about the slow disaster with heat wave. The second, I'll let you, I have a second question related to this, but I kind of slipped my mind. So I'll maybe hear what you say first. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Loretta. So yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, it is the latter. Like, I mean, I guess I don't want to be stuck between the are you reifying it or are you challenging it, because I do think it is important that the heat wave as like this like period of like whatever, a day, 2 days, 4 days, 5 days, like does like I mean that there are like emergency response measures that need to be in place for that period of time. So it's not completely to delegitimize attention to this particular moment. But I think recognizing that itself, like, and what makes like even the heat wave disastrous, like has like, I mean, it has a long kind of tail and a long it has long effects afterwards as well. And so everything from like urban design policies and the way like the cityscape itself is structured, who lives where, who has access to water and electricity, and all of these kind of questions. I mean, they are not the questions that like necessarily are going to get addressed if you keep paying attention to specifically just the moment of the heat wave. So none of your heat action plans take into account any of these larger like structural kind of issues that also need attention. Like to some extent, like the configuration of build space and like some of the longer term measures, but they also end up being very technocratic. Right? And so like one of the popular ones in India ends up being these cool roofs. So everybody talks about how you like put up these different kinds of roofs so that temperatures are contained somewhat, and like how do you minimize the urban heat island effect and so on. But they like a lot of that imagination still ends up being very technocratic. And so if we wanted to think about like some of the other kinds of like infrastructural issues and questions around social inequality and so on in the context of heat waves, I think we need to expand like what counts as disaster and what like and the kinds of things that we take into account when we account for disaster.
No, I absolutely agree. And I really like how you draw on the slow violence literature to emphasize, because I think one of the problem with maybe the overemphasis of the temporality of disaster in some of the work is that it overlooks not just the damage it has done to the infrastructure, but also kind of the psychological and the everyday damage to the people. And I think heat wave is so interesting because it's so mundane, you know, and I don't know if you've seen like when do people's works being counted as important? Because it seems like such a mundane complaint that, oh, it's too hot, or is it like only when the expertise come in, like you mentioned about the epistemic community in the end? Is it only when the experts say that, okay, we have a heat wave, when heat wave is a thing, is a disaster, when it counts, or is it like that power imbalance, like whose works count? So maybe you can say a little bit about that as well. Thank you.
So that definition of the heat wave is pretty standardized, and that's like it's standardized in the sense like whenever the temperature is above, like I believe 5 degrees above the normal for that time of the year on a sustained kind of basis, then like there's a heat wave that gets declared. There's some variation whether like it is in the plains or whether it is up in the mountains, and the humidity is another factor. So, but it is a very it is a very universal and a very abstract definition of what the heat wave is, right? And that's the level, officially that's when the heat wave gets declared. And it's important because that's when, only if you're able to declare a disaster can you actually then access the resources that it mobilized by calling something a disaster, right? So that the definition matters and its politics matters, right? So the epistemic community reference towards the end was actually something even more than that, because the particular organizations that I mentioned, the Public Health Foundation of India, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and there's a Mount Sinai in New York is one of the hospitals that's in the mix. There's a few of these individuals located in these particular institutions who were part of formulating the Ahindabad heat action plan, right? But they are also really, it helps that there's a national mandate now. The National Disaster Management Authority has asked states to formulate their own heat action plans. But these specific individuals have also committed to the idea that what they did in Ahmedabad is something that is worth replicating, and they really want to see it travel, right? And so that's it's the same group of people, quite often similar kind of funding agencies that are behind enabling that kind of travel, and that's the epistemic community that is coming together. That is interesting, right? And that's the connection we are also making to the literature background expertise within the disaster context.
So just the last question is, I'm sure you're aware of the group in Singapore who's also researching heat, because my friend Chris Cockney said I mentioned about your talk, and he said, oh, we've actually invited him to give a talk like before. So yeah. I'm wondering, can you say a little bit more about the policy, the approach to heat in places that's quite wealthy, like in Singapore, and air conditioning is a huge thing, how people and also people at the policy level, people who are making policy decisions, approach heat wave differently. I'm sure they look at things very differently from what you're looking at in India.
That's a good question, and I don't know that I have a good answer to that question. But so as part of the conference that Chris and other people organized in Singapore in late April, and there is, I think there is a couple of things that stood out to us as quite distinct in relationship to many of the presentations we heard then. So one, I think the kind of emphasis, I think, that just about every conversation around thermal governments in India and the analysis, just about any of that conversation begins with a recognition of the extreme kind of inequality that characterizes the society. And so I think just the starting point is just so different than some of the other spaces and other places that we have that we saw in that as part of that conference. Right, and some of the other especially discussions around air conditioning and such, right? And people worrying in the context of climate change, worrying about how do we potentially scale back, or potentially how do we think about the question of air conditioning and what it does to greenhouse gases and global warming and that kind of stuff. Right? Again, that as a starting point, just that isn't quite a starting point for us, at all. None of my none of air conditioning isn't even air conditioning at scale isn't ever considered a solution here. And that's I should also say that within those spaces, some of the wealthier nations, somebody in Singapore who was working on the Gulf countries, for example, right, had a very different analysis of how the Gulf countries actually, they just went about air conditioning at forever. It wasn't even a question until recently, as opposed to, I think, many of the cities and countries in Southeast Asia and East Asia approach that question somewhat differently. There's a recognition that of the vulnerability that the region generally faces and because of climate change. And then how do we innovate? How do we design? How do we think about how do we think about some of these questions? So I think there's considerable kind of diversity within even wealthier spaces in terms of how they frame the problem and then consequently how they approach the problem. I think the other one for us is just starting from a recognition of just extreme kind of inequality and the vulnerabilities that result from that means that the analysis starts at a somewhat different place.
Yeah, I think the air conditioning thing just amplifies the inequality of how climate change affects different group of people. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Loretta.
Thanks, Loretta. Thanks, Aalok. We have another question from Ishan.
Hi, Aalok. Thanks for this very interesting talk. So I was actually trying to think about how it compares to, for example, the other kind of climate management tools, more financialized tools, like the recent very popular carbon trading, carbon emission trading plan for markets in China. So I was thinking, maybe you have talked about this, but I'm just sorry about my connection. Sometimes it's not getting through very well. So I wonder if there's any kind of financialized tools or market-oriented mechanisms aside from this kind of city planning and this kind of public commitments to kind of combat this situation.
That's an interesting question, and I don't think I have an answer to that at all. I haven't seen much. And the only other kind of interventions I'm beginning to see it's always been part of the vocabulary and part of the part of the imagination, but I think you're beginning to see a little bit more of it as just architectural practices and thinking about how do we what in many ways were vernacular architectural practices anyway, which incorporated lots of passive cooling and things like that, which I'm beginning to see a little bit more of. But besides that, in terms of financial insight, no, I don't think I have come across much.
I have a question regarding the term cool infrastructures, if I may. I was kind of puzzled by it, and you did mention a couple of cooling technologies in the context of your talk, but you didn't quite really explore that. And I was wondering if that is part of the heat action plans as some kind of expert recommendation, or whether that is instead something that is evolving in society as part of a societal response to what is going on, or perhaps both. You mentioned cool roofs, and you mentioned as well air conditioning, both of them with incredible environmental costs. Are there any other cool infrastructures that you are going to be focusing on? Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that? Yeah.
Well, so I should say that the governance, the heat action plans and how they travel, that's that's a much smaller project within the larger project that we envision as the Cool Infrastructures project. It's so it's much more the latter to think about what kind of what kind of assemblages are mobilized, or are people developing in order to stay cool. Right? It's not new. They've already been living with rising temperatures for a while. It's not new in that sense. So it's to think about. It is to think about like what kind of like social relationships, what kind of devices, what kind of networks and so on are people embedded in order to stay cool. Yeah, so I don't know that we are like specifically going to focus on air conditioners or even cool roofs. And cool roofs are like, I'm not sure like what you had in mind with that, but like around here at least, like the idea of cool roofs is actually to think around like these non-reflect or like roofs that are like either like painted in some kind of a white coating or like maybe even some kind of a green coating, and they're called green roofs. And so to think about how do you prevent overheating of buildings in ways that are happening right now. So, and not nearly as like environmentally costly as something like air conditioning is. But I mean, if you think back to the survey that we did and that I told you about a little while ago, like what comes up most popularly is a table fan, right? It's not the air conditioner, right? I mean, so the devices that we are actually thinking about in terms of what are people using, the table fan comes up the most, and there's interesting regional kind of differences which we are trying to explore as well. So in response to this particular survey, for example, in the city of Hyderabad, nobody mentioned taking baths right, as a cooling practice, right? Whereas, like, I think the literature tells you that that is potentially the most effective way to regulate your body temperature. And that comes up a lot in our responses in Karachi, in our responses to Jakarta. That comes up a lot. Like people say, well, they cool by taking a bath. And that doesn't happen in Hyderabad. And we don't know like what quite explains these kind of regional differences as well. But I think, those are as much part of the cooling kind of infrastructures that we are talking about as might be air conditioning, as might be some of these other. There's definitely a class dimension to that discussion in terms of what technologies are accessible to whom and what spaces are accessible to whom.
I thought your discussion with Loretta was very interesting, and one of the things that sort of came out of the discussion was that the question about the distinctiveness of India as opposed to other contexts. I mean, I know it's still very early to kind of say something about that, but what would be your guess? I mean, what would be, other than a general kind of statement as in, placing India in the developing countries package, is there anything distinctive about what's going on in India regarding its action plan?
So, sure, I don't know a specific answer to that, but like just to give you a sense for like, so the conference that Loretta was talking about with Chris Courtney and others. And so Chris, who himself works on China, and there was another scholar who was working on China. And both of them worked in, like, what I understand are like the furnace cities of China, different furnace cities. There's 3 of them, and like both of them work in one or the other. Like something that like came across in both of those presentations is like in some ways like just the like mass kind of adaptation of air conditioning as well, and very like and one of the narratives of like what has shifted over time in China is this like practice of like what is communal sleeping, like people sleeping outdoors on their beds, and like so sleeping on like outside of their houses as a way of keeping cool. And that has entirely changed, right? And you see that like everything is like people have like moved indoors, and like that kind of socialization and that kind of that sense of community consequently has also like disappeared along the air conditioning, which is the air conditioning being the selfish technology and all of that. Right? Like I don't see that like at the level of practice, like and this was like especially striking for me because like every summer, like here in the city of Hyderabad, you still see like this the cityscape changing visibly, right? you will see the emergence of at the level of neighborhood, like markets, religious organizations, neighborhood organizations. All of them will start putting up these public water dispensers, right? And somebody will be serving water there throughout the day for various reasons, right? But that's, the cityscape visibly transforms, right, to accommodate for some of these seasonal rhythms. There is a seasonal kind of rhythm also to how labor flows in the city, right? And which some of which is going to get reflected in these questions around heat as well. So while I don't know what the distinctiveness is, like I do think, like when I even listen to like some of the other transformations that have happened in the region, I do see that there is regional variation and regional difference, and part of the job is to map some of that.
Okay, I have two final questions, very quick ones, because we're also running out of time. So one is, I'm quite curious, at some point in the talk, you mentioned that the Ahmedabad heat action plan revealed some connections between city and state level sort of officials. And as someone who works on China, I can't help but be curious about, what exactly the connections here are, and who is actually more instrumental in the development of these plans. What is the role of the central state? Does it have an overarching role, as certainly you would expect to be the case of China? Or instead, it leaves a lot of, autonomous decision-making powers to city-level municipalities. Could you tell us a little bit about that? And then, finally, the question about the future research. I mean, the project as you presented it today is incredibly comprehensive. On the one hand, it seems to be focusing on policy-making issues. On the other hand, you also seem to be taking into account the reactions from ordinary people, even possibly developments in the economy as a response to a new wave of heat action plans. So are you going to be focusing more on policy making in the future? Are you going to be keeping a sort of a wider sort of net and focus? What are the plans for the coming years? Thank you. Sorry about this. I know it's a very ambitious question, but very important.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to answer briefly. The first question around the relationship between the local city level government and the state level government. So until fairly recently, cities in India haven't had much of a role in governance. I mean, we have had municipal corporations, but it's only in 2014-15 that we have what are now called urban local bodies, which have greater authority and greater decision-making power for their own jurisdictions than used to be the case. And even then, not so much, right? I mean, even then, like by and large, authority is either at the level of the state government or it is at the level of the national government, right? The constitution kind of differentiates in terms of like which government has authority over what issues. Right? And so law and order, for example, is a state government issue, but taxes might be a central government issue, and so on and so on. So Ahmedabad in that way is a unique case because there's enough of an appetite then to actually take on the question of heat governance, partly because of its history of disaster with the earthquake and then the heat wave. So there is enough people interested at the level of the municipal corporation and at the level of these public health institutions that there's an interest in thinking about what heat governance looks like and what might we need to do, who all needs to be on the table, how do we coordinate, and so on. Subsequently, with the formation of the National Disaster Management Authority, and then there being a mandate by the National Disaster Management Authority that states plan for what do you do? Like how do we mobilize in the case of heat waves? So just because there's a mandate that that really helps with the scaling up, right? The central level government, the national government, still plays something of a coordinating role in this instance, and it's the state governments that then pick up the mandate and then that are responsible for formulating these heat action plans. Which, like I say, like then it basically means that the same people involved with the Ahmedabad plan then also act as consultants, et cetera, in like making these other heat action plans possible. So that's the question to that's the response to the city relationship between the cities and the states. Right? In the case of Hyderabad, which is where we will do our fieldwork, which is where I'm based, like it's it helps that the government at the city level is the same political party as the government at the state level. So in terms of just alignments, in terms of resource flows, etc., I think that helps quite a bit. But that might not always be the case. Larger plans. I think policy is so we'll continue to map governance initiatives and map, like we have a fairly good understanding at this point of like what is like the nature of the discussion when it comes to heat action like plans and governing extreme heat in the context of India. And we have, but yeah, in the research team, it's a much large, like it will be a larger research team, and will continue developing like along these different axes. So there is somebody who will continue working on the governance question, but this time, like take the critique. And part of the idea is take this critique of heat action plans not being locally situated, and especially with attention to vulnerability, and to think about, so like what does it mean to then think about like what kind of knowledges do we actually need to then like think about the heat action plan differently. Like if it isn't situated at the moment, like how can we, like what do we need in order to for it to look somewhat different? What would it mean for Hyderabad's heat action plan to actually not just emulate the Ahmedabad heat action plan, but also have its own kind of local mandate and responding to local kind of specificities. So there is that kind of work that will continue. At this moment, we are working on also simultaneously, like I said earlier, like creating heat maps for the city, like mapping both spatially as well as like mapping on other kinds of things, in order to think about like what are some of the what are some locations in the city, what are some sites, and some of them might be just spatial locations like urban slums, but it might be like also just people who work outdoors, right? Social locations like that, and so on. To think about who is it that is going to tell us about, like how can we imagine the study in a way that helps us understand vulnerability in the context of extreme heat and so on, in order to then drive field work for the research further. There's other people who are working right now on documenting, maybe just like documenting different kind of academic and gray literature in the context of Hyderabad and quite a lot of detail. One of the things we did in the past month or two as just a side project, because so many of the countries and cities, including Hyderabad, has such a large kind of Muslim population, and Ramzan and the summer have been overlapping for the past few years. So we had a separate small project on heat and Ramzan, and to think about like how that helps us to think about, again, how people modify their eating habits, consumption habits, how they move around and so on. Taking heat into account. So with Jakarta, Karachi, Hyderabad, that seemed to be a particularly potent kind of window into this question of heat as well. So those things, yeah, it's still the beginning for us. It's like another 2.5 years on. Yeah, we'll continue in different kinds of ways.
Thanks, Aalok. This is a great project. I mean, it's definitely one of the most pressing questions of our time: how to govern global heating, and what are the effects of new governing rationalities of global heating around the world. So I think it's a very important project. Thanks again for your very rich presentation. Before we go, let me just let everyone know that the next Sci-Tech Asia virtual seminar is going to take place on June 25th. And the speaker is going to be Professor Lily Lai from Peking University. The talk is entitled Toward Knowing, Engaging Chinese Medical Worlds. So June 25th, we're going to go to China. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking again our speaker, Aalok Khandekar. Thank you so much, Aalok.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.